According to the Treasury Department, the United States government now pays more than $1 trillion per year just in interest on the national debt. Not on roads, not on hospitals, not on defense, just interest. According to the American Action Forum, that single line item, interest payments alone, now exceeds what America spends on Medicare. It exceeds what America spends on national defense. In fact, according to their analysis of fiscal year 2024 data, interest on the debt has become the second largest expenditure in the entire federal budget, behind only Social Security. Think about that for a moment. The government is now spending more money paying interest to bondholders than it spends protecting the country, more than it spends keeping elderly Americans alive through Medicare. According to the Government Accountability Office, gross interest payments hit $1.2 trillion in fiscal year 2025. That works out to roughly $2.7 billion per day, $112 million per hour, nearly $2 million every single minute. And here is what makes this truly alarming. According to Federal Reserve data, just 3 years ago, in fiscal year 2022, interest payments were $476 billion. Today, they have more than doubled. According to the Congressional Budget Office, they are on track to hit $1.8 trillion by 2035. And by 2055, the CBO project's interest payments will consume nearly $5 trillion annually. This is not a slow-moving problem. This is a runaway train. Welcome to the money signal, where money, power, and economics collide, and nothing is ever as simple as they want you to believe. Over the next 25 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how America reached this trillion-dollar milestone, using official data from the Treasury Department, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Federal Reserve. I'm going to walk you through the hidden mechanism that allowed politicians to double the national debt over the past decade while paying almost no price, and why that mechanism just stopped working. And I am going to show you what the chairman of the Federal Reserve, the Treasury Secretary, and the CEO of America's largest bank are all saying about where this leads and what it means for your mortgage, your savings, and your retirement. By the end, you'll understand why every major credit rating agency has now stripped America of its AAA rating for the first time in history, and why some of the smartest investors on Wall Street are warning that we have less than a decade before this becomes a full-blown crisis. Spoiler. According to Jamie Dimon, CEO of JPMorgan Chase, we can see the cliff. It is about 10 years out. To understand how we got here, we need to start with a number that sounds impossibly large, but is actually the key to everything. According to the Joint Economic Committee of the United States Senate, the national debt currently stands at $38.43 trillion as of January 2026. That number is growing at approximately $6.17 billion per day, or $71,462 per second. But here is what most people miss. The size of the debt matters far less than the cost of servicing it. A family with a $500,000 mortgage at 3% interest faces a very different financial reality than the same family with the same mortgage at 7% interest. The principle is identical. The monthly payment is not even close. According to Federal Reserve data, the average interest rate on outstanding Treasury debt was approximately 1.55% in December of 2020. By December of 2025, according to the same data source, that average rate had risen to 3.36%. That might not sound dramatic. But when you apply that rate increase to tens of trillions of dollars in debt, the math becomes staggering. According to the Peterson Foundation, net interest payments jumped from $345 billion in fiscal year 2020 to $970 billion in fiscal year 2025. That is a 181% increase in just 5 years. The debt grew significantly during that period, but interest payments grew nearly 3 times faster. Here is the mechanism that explains why. For over a decade, from 2008 until 2022, the Federal Reserve held interest rates at or near zero for most of that time. According to Federal Reserve records, the federal funds rate sat between 0 and 0.25% for 7 straight years after the 2008 financial crisis. Then again, during the pandemic, rates dropped to effectively zero from March 2020 until March 2022. This created what economists call a masking effect. According to Treasury Department data, the national debt held by the public grew from $9 trillion in 2010 to $21 trillion by 2020. That is a 133% increase in just 1 decade. But during that same period, according to the same Treasury data, gross interest payments rose only from $414 billion to $523 billion, a mere 26% increase. Politicians had discovered what appeared to be free money. They could borrow trillions upon trillions of dollars, and the interest cost barely moved. The debt doubled, but the payments stayed manageable. According to analysis from the Bipartisan Policy Center, this period created a dangerous complacency in Washington. Lawmakers became accustomed to borrowing without consequence. Deficit spending became the default response to every crisis, every priority, every political promise. Then, in March of 2022, the Federal Reserve began raising rates. According to Fed records, the federal funds rate went from 0.08% in February 2022 to 5.33% by July 2023. That is the most aggressive rate hiking cycle in over 40 years. And suddenly, all that accumulated debt started repricing. Treasury bonds mature and roll over constantly. When a 5-year bond issued in 2019 at 1.5% matured in 2024, the government had to replace it with a new bond at 4 or 5%. According to Treasury data, the government issues hundreds of billions of dollars in new debt every single quarter just to refinance maturing obligations. Each refinancing locks in higher rates, and the process compounds. According to the American Action Forum, net interest costs jumped 62% in a single year, from fiscal year 2022 to 2023. That is the largest single-year percentage increase on record. The masking effect had ended. The bill had come due. Now, here is where the official narrative breaks down. You might think that when interest payments start consuming $1 trillion per year, that would trigger an emergency response. Budget negotiations, spending cuts, revenue increases, something. According to the Congressional Budget Office's January 2025 budget outlook, here is what is actually projected to happen. The deficit for fiscal year 2025 is expected to be $1.9 trillion, not declining, growing. According to the same CBO report, deficits are projected to remain above $1.5 trillion every single year for the next decade. Cumulative deficits from 2026 through 2035 will total approximately $22 trillion in new borrowing. This means the debt will keep growing. Interest rates show no signs of returning to zero, and therefore interest payments will continue to accelerate. According to CBO projections, interest payments will reach $1.3 to $1.4 trillion by 2030, $1.8 trillion by 2035, and $4.8 trillion annually by 2055. Let me put those numbers in context. According to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, by 2035, interest payments will consume 22.2% of all federal revenue. That means more than 1 out of every 5 tax dollars collected will go straight to bondholders. Not to any government program, not to any public benefit, just interest. And according to CBO long-term projections, by 2052, interest costs will exceed all discretionary spending combined. That means interest payments alone will cost more than defense, education, transportation, scientific research, and every other non-mandatory program put together. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell addressed this trajectory directly in a 60 Minutes interview in February 2024. Powell stated, quote, "The U.S. federal government is on an unsustainable fiscal path, and that just means that the debt is growing faster than the economy. I do not think that is at all controversial. Effectively, we are borrowing from future generations. It is time for us to get back to putting a priority on fiscal sustainability," end quote. Notice what Powell said. The debt is growing faster than the economy. That is the critical threshold. An economy can sustain significant debt as long as growth outpaces borrowing costs. But according to CBO projections, the debt to GDP ratio, which measures debt relative to the size of the economy, will reach 107% by 2029. That would exceed the previous record of 106% set during World War II. By 2035, according to the same projections, debt to GDP will hit 118%. By 2055, 156%. The economy is not growing faster than the debt, not even close. The evidence for this pattern is not theoretical. It is documented throughout history. According to economic historians, every major empire that has accumulated unsustainable debt has followed a remarkably similar trajectory. The details vary. The destination does not. Consider Spain under King Philip II in the 16th century. According to historical records analyzed by economists at the Centre de Recerca and Economía Internacional, Spain controlled the largest empire in the world. Gold and silver flowed from the Americas in quantities never before seen. Spain appeared to be the richest nation on earth. Yet, according to these same historical records, Philip II defaulted on Spanish sovereign debt 4 times. In 1557, in 1560, in 1575, and again in 1596. How does a nation with seemingly unlimited wealth go bankrupt 4 times in 40 years? According to the research, debt servicing consumed up to 60% of Spanish crown revenue at its peak. The gold from the Americas was not building Spanish industry or infrastructure. It was flowing directly to foreign creditors, primarily German and Italian bankers who had financed Spain's endless wars. The parallel to modern America is uncomfortable but instructive. The wealth exists, the revenue exists. But when debt service consumes too large a share, there is nothing left for anything else. According to historians, Spain's decline from global superpower to second-rate European nation took roughly a century, but the fiscal dynamics that made decline inevitable were locked in decades earlier, while Spain still appeared dominant. Now consider Britain after World War II. According to Bank of England historical data, British government debt reached 270% of GDP by 1946. That is far worse than America's current position, even under the most pessimistic projections. Britain escaped this debt burden without formal default. But according to economic historians, the escape came at enormous cost. Britain experienced sustained inflation throughout the late 1940s and 1950s that eroded the real value of that debt. Interest rates were deliberately kept below inflation, a policy economists call financial repression. It meant that savers and bondholders were slowly expropriated to pay for the government's past borrowing. Britain also lost its empire during this period. The economic constraints imposed by the debt made it impossible to maintain global military commitments. Within 2 decades, the British pound lost its status as the world's reserve currency, replaced by the American dollar. According to analysis from the International Monetary Fund, Britain went from global hegemon to IMF bailout recipient, requiring emergency loans in 1976 in just 30 years. The question is whether America is following a similar path, but on an accelerated timeline. Now look at today's data. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the debt-to-GDP ratio currently sits at approximately 100%. The post-war record of 106% will be broken by 2029. According to CBO long-term projections, the ratio will reach 156% by 2055. At that level, according to IMF research on sovereign debt dynamics, even modest interest rate increases can trigger debt spirals where governments must borrow simply to pay interest on existing debt. Let us run the warning sign checklist, using criteria established by economists who study sovereign debt crises. Warning sign number 1, interest payments exceeding 15 to 20% of government revenue. According to the Peterson Foundation, interest payments consumed 18.4% of federal revenue in fiscal year 2025. That threshold has been crossed. Warning sign number 2, sustained primary deficits, meaning deficits even before counting interest costs. According to CBO data, the United States has run primary deficits for 14 of the last 15 years. Check. Warning sign number 3, rising share of foreign-held debt creating external vulnerability. According to Treasury data, foreign holders own approximately $8 trillion of U.S. debt, roughly 24% of debt held by the public. While this share has actually declined from its peak, it remains substantial enough to create risk if foreign appetite for Treasury bonds diminishes. Warning sign number 4, loss of credit rating signaling market concerns. According to rating agency records, the United States has now lost its top credit rating from all 3 major agencies. Standard & Poor's downgraded the United States on August 5, 2011. Fitch followed on August 1, 2023, and on May 16, 2025. Moody's became the last major agency to strip America of its AAA rating. According to the Moody's downgrade announcement, quote, successive U.S. administrations and Congress have failed to agree on measures to reverse the trend of large annual fiscal deficits and growing interest costs, end quote. Moody's projects federal debt will reach 134% of GDP by 2035. 4 warning signs, 4 boxes checked. The question is what happens next. According to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, speaking at the American Economic Association meeting in January 2026, the risk of fiscal dominance is real and growing. Yellen stated, quote, should we be concerned about the potential for fiscal dominance? In my opinion, the answer is yes, end quote. Fiscal dominance is an economic term for a scenario where government debt becomes so large that it effectively dictates monetary policy. The Federal Reserve loses its independence because it cannot raise interest rates without triggering a debt crisis. The central bank becomes, in Yellen's words, quote, the fiscal authority's financing arm, end quote. In plain language, the Fed would be forced to print money to keep the government solvent, regardless of inflation consequences. According to former Federal Reserve economist Eric Leeper at the University of Virginia, the traditional assumption that debt would eventually be paid through future taxes and growth, what he calls the Hamilton norm, quote, died in 2020, end quote. Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund, has been issuing increasingly urgent warnings. In March 2025, Dalio told CNBC, quote, we have a very severe supply-demand problem. The U.S. has to sell a quantity of debt that the world is not going to want to buy. You're going to see shocking developments in terms of how that is going to be dealt with, end quote. Dalio describes the dynamic as a debt-death spiral, quote, where the debtor needs to borrow money in order to pay debt service and it accelerates, end quote. In separate comments, Dalio compared the situation to, quote, plaque building up in the circulatory system, end quote, warning that an economic heart attack could occur within 3 years. Jamie Dimon, CEO of JPMorgan Chase, the largest bank in America, has been equally direct. At a panel discussion in January 2024, Dimon stated, quote, "It is a cliff. We see the cliff. It is about 10 years out. There will be a rebellion in markets, and that is the worst possible way to do it," end quote. At the World Economic Forum in Davos in January 2026, Dimon called the national debt one of two, quote, "tectonic plates," end quote, that may crash in the near future. These are not fringe commentators. These are the Treasury Secretary of the United States, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, the founder of the world's largest hedge fund, and the CEO of America's largest bank. They are all saying the same thing. Here is what this means for you personally. According to Fannie Mae research, mortgage rates are closely correlated with the yield on 10-year Treasury bonds. When the government's borrowing costs rise, your borrowing costs rise with them. According to Freddie Mac data, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate bottomed at 2.65% in January 2021. By October 2023, that same rate had reached 7.79%. On a $400,000 mortgage, according to standard amortization calculations, the monthly payment at 2.65% is roughly $1,624. At 7.79%, the monthly payment is roughly $2,889. That is an increase of $1,265 per month, over 78% higher for the exact same house. According to Consumer Financial Protection Bureau data, this mortgage rate spike has locked millions of Americans out of homeownership entirely and trapped millions more in their current homes because selling and buying a new home would dramatically increase their monthly payments. Credit card rates tell a similar story. According to Federal Reserve data, the average credit card annual percentage rate was 14.6% in February 2022. By August 2024, that average had risen to 21.8%. For a consumer carrying $10,000 in credit card debt, according to standard interest calculations, this rate increase adds roughly $720 in annual interest charges. According to analysis from the Peterson Foundation, there is also an indirect cost that economists call crowding out. When the government borrows trillions of dollars, it competes with private businesses and individuals for available capital. According to modeling from the Penn-Wharton budget model, every additional dollar of federal deficit reduces private investment by approximately 33 cents. Less private investment means fewer factories, less equipment, slower productivity growth, and ultimately lower wages. According to CBO estimates, the crowding out effect from projected deficits will reduce GDP by approximately 1.2% by 2034 compared to a scenario with stable debt. That might sound abstract, but 1.2% of GDP translates to roughly $360 billion in lost economic output. Spread across the population, that is lost wages, lost business income, and a lower standard of living than Americans would otherwise have. According to the Joint Economic Committee, here is the per capita breakdown of the current debt. Total national debt, $38.43 trillion. Debt per American citizen, $112,966. Debt per American household, $285,127. Debt added per day, $6.17 billion. Now consider what that debt is buying. According to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the cumulative interest bill from 2026 through 2035 will total approximately $13.8 trillion. $13.8 trillion that will not build a single road, will not fund a single school, will not provide a single benefit to any American citizen. $13.8 trillion flowing directly to bondholders, a significant portion of them foreign, for the privilege of having borrowed money in the past. According to CBO projections, by 2035, the government will spend more on interest than on all of the following programs combined: veterans benefits, transportation, education, science and technology research, international affairs. Interest will consume more resources than all of these priorities put together. And according to those same projections, the pressure on Social Security and Medicare will intensify. The Social Security Trust Fund is projected to be depleted by 2033. According to Social Security Administration actuaries, if no reforms are enacted, benefits would be automatically cut by approximately 24% at that point. For a typical retired couple receiving average benefits, according to these calculations, that represents a reduction of roughly $18,400 per year. Medicare's Hospital Insurance Trust Fund faces depletion between 2031 and 2036, according to Medicare trustees. At that point, hospital payments would automatically be reduced by approximately 11%. The trillion-dollar interest bill is not creating these entitlement shortfalls, but it is making them harder to address. Every dollar going to bondholders is a dollar unavailable to shore up Social Security or Medicare. The United States does retain one crucial advantage that other debt crisis nations lacked: According to International Monetary Fund data, the US dollar remains the world's dominant reserve currency, comprising approximately 58% of global central bank reserves. This status creates automatic demand for Treasury securities. Foreign central banks need dollars for international trade. They park those dollars in Treasury bonds. According to research from the Federal Reserve, this reserve currency privilege reduces U.S. borrowing costs by an estimated 10 to 30 basis points compared to what they would otherwise be. According to economists at the Peterson Institute, reserve currency status increases the sustainable debt level for the United States by an estimated 22% above what other advanced economies could carry. But there are warning signs that this privilege may be eroding. According to IMF data, the dollar's share of global reserves has fallen to a two-decade low of 58%, down from over 70% in the early 2000s. According to a CFA Institute survey of institutional investors, 63% expect the dollar to lose at least partial reserve status within 5 to 15 years. According to World Gold Council data, central banks purchased more gold in 2024 and 2025 than in any period on record, suggesting diversification away from dollar assets. Goldman Sachs analysts have warned that, quote, the free lunch period for the dollar may be ending, end quote. European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde observed in 2023 that, quote, the dominant role of the US dollar is no longer certain, end quote. The loss of reserve currency status would not happen overnight. According to historical research from the Bank of England, Britain's pound sterling maintained significant reserve status for decades after British economic dominance had faded. But the trajectory matters. A gradual erosion of reserve currency status would mean gradually higher borrowing costs precisely as the United States needs to borrow the most. The arithmetic is relentless. According to CBO projections, there's no scenario under current law where the debt stabilizes. There's no scenario where interest payments plateau. There's no scenario where the problem solves itself. Fed Chairman Powell put it simply, quote, we do not need to pay the debt down. We do not need to balance the budget. We just need the economy to grow faster than the debt. And that is not happening, end quote. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2055, debt will reach 156% of GDP. Interest will consume 28% of federal revenue, and the government will face choices that are all unpleasant. Dramatically higher taxes, dramatically lower benefits, inflation that erodes the value of savings, or some combination of all three. Jamie Dimon warned that when the crisis arrives, it will come through markets, a buyer's strike, a rebellion, a sudden loss of confidence that sends borrowing costs spiraling higher just when the government can least afford it. Ray Dalio warned it could feel like a heart attack, sudden and severe, after years of invisible damage. The Federal Reserve, the Treasury Department, the Congressional Budget Office, the rating agencies, and the leaders of America's largest financial institutions are all issuing the same warning. And yet, according to CBO projections, deficits will continue growing, debt will continue growing, interest payments will continue growing. Every year, every month, every day. $6.17 billion added to the tab today, another $6 billion tomorrow, and the day after that. The mathematics does not care about politics. It does not care about intentions. It does not care about campaign promises. According to the Peterson Foundation, the last time the United States had a budget surplus was fiscal year 2001. In the 25 years since, the government has borrowed more than $30 trillion. The interest on that borrowing now exceeds what we spend on Medicare, exceeds what we spend on defense. And according to every serious projection, it will keep growing until something breaks. The signal has been there for years. According to the data, it is getting louder. Most people are not listening. Now you are. History does not repeat. But according to the historical record, it does warn. Spain ignored the warning. Britain ignored the warning. Empires do not collapse because of enemies. According to every economic historian who has studied the question, they collapse because they go broke. The enemies just show up afterward to collect the pieces. $1 trillion in interest, and counting. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I will show you where to look.